Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. I'm Dr. Nicole, and on today's episode, we're circling back to a topic so many of you ask about on a regular basis: how to manage picky eating issues with your kids. We've covered this in various ways on the show previously, but today we're going to focus in on a really specific strategy that I think is key to helping both picky eaters and kids with feeding disorders. And it's called bridging, or sometimes people call it chaining. There's some different words for it, but it basically provides a comfortable way to get kids from the foods they currently eat and prefer to new foods that they aren't currently eating or they don't yet feel comfortable with. I have seen this type of approach make such a difference for so many kids and even some adults over the years that I really wanted to devote an entire episode to it. So to talk with us about what this approach is, how it can be helpful, I've invited Jenny Friedman on the show today. Let me tell you a bit about her. She's a registered dietitian who specializes in pediatric extreme picky eating. Known for her playful and approachable style, Jennifer is a leading resource for parents and professionals working with children who struggle at meal times. She's the author of Stories of Extreme Picky Eating and shares her insight on her website and her blog and on social media, which is where I came across Jenny and her work. It is such a pleasure to have you with us today. Welcome to the show, Jenny.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
So I would love to start by knowing what the story is behind how you got really focused on helping picky eaters. I find that most of us as professionals, there's something either professionally early on in our career or something personally that we've dealt with that sort of leads us down the path of what we're focused on. So I'm curious what that story is like for you.
Yeah, so for me, it was more of a professional journey. Growing up, and for me, food has always been a huge part of my life and my family, and it's a big, it's a personal interest of mine. So that is part of it, that I find so much connection and enjoyment with food, and I want everybody to be able to do that if they are interested in doing so. So that is part of it, but professionally, I think this was always something deep down that I was interested in. I just was not able to articulate it. And when I was earning my degree in nutrition, I started participating in some research projects in schools where we were trying to help kids eat more fruits and vegetables. We were trying to do some diet improvement interventions. And that led me also to doing some cooking and nutrition education in schools. And in all of these experiences, I saw that learning to accept these new foods came really easily for some kids. And there were some kids who, understood it cognitively. Okay, these foods might be good for me. Okay, you're asking me to eat them. You're making it fun, but there's no way I'm going near it. We're cooking and that's very cool. I'm just going to sit on the side. And so I became very interested in what was holding some kids back and what made some kids have such an easier time with new foods. And that, many years and twists and turns later led me to where I am today.
I think that that's so true, that there can be such a difference between kids, even within the same family. We see families at the clinic where they're like, look, my first two kids pretty much ate what's in front of them. They're excited about things. And now I've got this one who it's like totally different ballgame. So even within the same family, there can be really a lot of variation.
Definitely. And that's so interesting too. I speak with a lot of families in my own practice who, if their first child is the one who struggled to eat, they maybe don't even realize it until they have number two. And they're like, oh, there's a lot of different things going on here.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I'd love to have you just share a bit about what are some of the main issues that you see that kids have when it comes to picky eating. So, we throw that term around, right? And I think it would be helpful to get into what constitutes picky eating versus other problems. We can do that next. But, parents and even professionals use the term picky eating to describe, lots of things. I'm curious for you in your practice and your experience with kids, what's kind of at the root? What are some of the main common issues that you see that lead to kids really being more picky or restrictive in their eating preferences?
Yeah, I love that you brought that up because it's so true. I talk about this in all of my work. It's that picky is a great term for us to use to describe what's going on, but that really does not capture what is happening here. So it's not that these kids are fickle or fussy or overly particular. more often there is something sort of lurking beneath the surface. So I see a lot of sensory issues. So children who, this might manifest as a preference for a particular texture, or gosh, it could even be a color or like a temperature of food. So we see a lot of kids who are maybe gravitating towards like a crunchy texture, for example. That could also be due to potentially an oral motor deficit. So it could be easier in the mouth for them to manipulate certain textures. I see as well just some generalized anxiety that might be manifesting at meal times. And often I think the other kind of big umbrella would be maybe a comorbid medical condition, or maybe a developmental delay. So even something just like constipation, allergies, something kind of as simple as that can lead to like a bit of trauma with food, and can sort of manifest down the road as that extreme selectivity or pickiness.
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad you raised that, because I think that's a really overlooked issue. A kid who's chronically really constipated, or is having a lot of constant like postnasal drip from allergies or something, that totally changes the experience of eating, right? There can be like outright some pain and physical discomfort involved. It can also, like, I'm thinking about allergies, postnasal drip, even kids with like chronic ear infection issues, it changes your sensory experience with food, right? It changes the taste, it changes the smell, all of those things. And we look at it through the perspective of our adult experience and lens. But when we really can shift and see, oh gosh, yeah, how that would feel, or what that experience would be through the eyes of a child with those kinds of issues, I think that's a really important thing to consider.
Yeah. And sometimes it's all of these things, or not all, but it can be many different things. So yes, I think it is really important. That's one of the first things that I always look for. And I think that's really important if you're home dealing with this, is to sort of think like, what's the root of this? Nobody is choosing to be picky. That's not fun. We're wired to want to eat a variety of different foods. That's in our DNA, so we can, continue, so we can grow and be, if our kids can grow and be healthy. So it's really important to think about what's behind the issues. And that's part of how we can help to resolve them, of course.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And there's the parental piece of this too, which, certainly not putting blame on parents, but we do as parents, there's this feedback loop between us and our kids, right? And you talked about anxiety. There can be anxiety on the part of the child. When we bring anxiety literally to the table, our own anxiety of feeding kids, and maybe our own experiences as a child with food, or maybe even some traumas or things that we've had around eating or food, that really can create some dynamics there too that can lead to things on the kid's side of things.
That most certainly can. So it is very difficult as a parent. You just want your child to eat. You just, it's coming from a good place. Yeah. But you're right. When we bring our stress to the table, that, at the very least can increase our child's stress. Mm-hmm. And when they're stressed, their appetite goes down. Mm-hmm. They're less likely to eat. When they're more anxious, they don't want to eat. And, maybe even the most simple level, anytime that we come really feeling that pressure, or really putting, putting that pressure on, even for a particular food or a particular meal, kids don't want to do what we want them to do, so it can be a lot more complex than that, but it is, I do find it's so much easier said than done. But when we can kind of come to the table, just trusting them to do what they need to do, and, trying to try not to bring any particular expectations. That's really when kids can start to feel more open, and maybe also gives us the opportunity as a parent to sort of just be open and be able to get some of that, like you said, it's a feedback loop, get some of that information that we can then use to better support them.
Yeah. And I do think it's so hard for parents. I was saying to you before we even started the show about how this is such, like, definitely in the top 5 topics that listeners ask about. And I think it's because we feed our kids all day long, right? I mean, it's like food is just like constantly, how you feel like we just got cleaned up from one meal and now, oh my gosh, we're preparing the next one. And so I do think that's why when there are some of these stressors or challenges or issues around eating, it can feel nonstop to a parent. It can feel very stressful and anxiety provoking, because it's just between meals and snacks and packing lunches and all that. It just can feel like it's a constant issue.
Yeah, definitely. It's all day. You're doing it all day long. And when you're done, it's like you said, you're planning for the next one.
Yeah. So before we dive into really talking about this idea of bridging and how to help kids get more comfortable, let's touch on, the difference between a child who we might just refer to as a picky eater, who developmentally is on track, with their overall development, who is really doing well in, maybe all other aspects of their life, but is more picky, has more rigid preferences, versus a child where maybe a parent does need to be concerned that, oh, this is more than just, run-of-the-mill picky eating preferences. There's actually some kind of feeding problem or disorder going on. What are some of the red flags, or what are some of the things that you really want parents to be aware of? Because I think that is a very important distinction.
This is indeed. And it's, I think we get parents, I hear so often that parents are told all the time, don't worry about it. This is normal. And their internal alarm is going off and it doesn't feel normal, but they can't find the help. And it's even difficult to find, so we're asking for some parameters here and there's nothing concrete, there's no like guideline of this is when the, the alarm should be going off. So it is hard. Some of the things that I look for can be total number of foods. Mm-hmm. So, if you're kind of hovering in that like 20-ish range, that can be okay. It's low, but okay. Anything under that, really, I work with a lot of families who are in like the five total foods. Yeah. That's not enough foods, Yeah. I guess another way you could think about it is, can you create a totally distinct menu on 2 different days? So we've got like an A menu and a B menu. If you can do that, you're in a pretty decent place. I see a lot of, if you see anxiety when new foods are around, if a child cannot tolerate even eating with the family, or just having foods in the house, knowing that they're on the table, that would be a red flag. An inability to eat outside of the house, or again, to eat with others. If this is really starting to limit your life or your child's life, where going to birthday parties becomes difficult, or they cannot eat in the school cafeteria, you're worried you can't send them away to summer camp. That's something worth looking into. If your child is missing any food groups entirely, so if there are 0 vegetables and maybe 0 forms of protein other than milk, say, that could be something that you want to look into. And I think kind of maybe the last big trigger would be an extreme rigidity with their food. So this can be, we eat yogurt, but it's actually only this one particular yogurt from this one particular pouch. It has to be very, very specific. Or maybe they eat grilled cheese, but actually it's only if dad makes it and it's only on this one plate. And that can be something that's definitely unusual. So that would be a trigger as well.
Yeah, those are great things to keep in mind. And really, as you're talking, I'm thinking there's 2 pieces here we're looking at. There's the piece of, yes, can your child sustain like physical growth and development on what they're eating? But there's also this big quality of life piece that, because we do eat all day long, multiple meal snacks and things, a child who is extremely rigid or very limited, that does really impact the quality of their life, not only at home, but outside of the home, and especially as they get older. And so even if a child is technically eating enough where they're still growing and can exist on that food, the question really becomes, how substantially is it impacting their quality of life and the family's quality of life?
Of course. And I'm happy you brought that up, because that most often I see those types of children who are maybe even overweight. They're growing well. They've maintained their growth curve. Everything seems fine. If that is not the case, then yes, that's a red flag. If we're losing weight, if they're not feeling well, doing well, then that is definitely something you need to look into. But more often I see it's sort of like this silent, it's something that from the surface does not appear to be really an issue. Nothing seems to be wrong, but you can see how, even down the line or at home, that this could become very challenging. And I do see it as kids start to get older and they're a little more independent, that's when sort of like the social ramifications can come in as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get into how we can help support these kids to feel more comfortable with new foods. Because to me, I look at it as that's really what we want here. I don't ever want any child, whether it's with food or anything else in their life, to be sort of confined to this, little box or this sort of prison of their own anxiety and discomfort, and not be given the opportunity to expand and stretch and just get more comfortable with things. And I think food is a big one for that. So what are some of the ways that we can help kids get more comfortable? And I know one of the things that you talk quite a bit about in your work is this idea of bridging, how we comfortably or more comfortably help kids move from the things that they currently will eat and say they like to some different options.
Yeah, so this bridging concept is a really helpful one for very hesitant children, because this is all about making small changes to preferred foods. And so we're really starting at a place of comfort. We're starting from preferred, and we are trying to maintain as many things that keep a child comfortable, as many things that they like and that they tend to rely on their, on their plates. We want to keep that as consistent as we can for as long as we can. So this concept of bridging, it's really just about making connections, and we can think about it in terms of food, which is where we'll spend most of the time. But I also want to touch on sort of this idea of like cognitive bridges, which is just a tip that you can use at home anytime you're introducing a new food or anytime there's something new on the table. I just like to draw connections. So you're eating an apple, your child loves pretzels and chips, and you bite into your apple and it's like, ooh, this is, you can make the observation that this apple is really crunchy, just like a pretzel, except it's a little juicier and sweeter. So those sorts of connections are really helpful, just to give your child a little bit more information and start to highlight how things are similar, because so often I think they're seeing things as very distinct. And so this same concept is we can apply to preferred foods, to actually introducing new foods. So what you want to do with this is take a preferred food and you're just really going to make a small change to it, or find another food with a very small change. And the idea is that over time, your child will, first of all, have a more they will have an easier time accepting this new food because it's similar to their preferred food. So instead of, Nicole, you gave us the example, before we came on, if they like cookies and we're randomly introducing a carrot, like those are very different foods. They can be a very far, difficult journey for them to get to the point where a carrot feels comfortable. But if we're starting with a cookie, and maybe we are, transitioning to maybe a homemade cookie that eventually has some carrots in it, or we're going from like a chocolate chip cookie to a chocolate chip muffin to a muffin with carrot in it. We're sort of making those small steps along the way that can sort of ease our kids into feeling more comfortable with these new foods. And you can see how along the way that creates a little bridge there, a cookie muffin bridge.
Yeah, I love that, a cookie muffin bridge. But I think it's so helpful because what you said at the beginning of our conversation about, the piece of anxiety and what feels safe to kids. And I think food is one of the ways that kids feel in control, right? And when we feel in control of something, it brings our anxiety down. If I know exactly what this is going to look like, taste like, be like, I feel in control, it brings my stress and anxiety level down. And, one of the things you shared too is that when stress and anxiety is up, we don't feel hungry. Our appetite is suppressed. We don't want to eat. So this idea of keeping the stress and anxiety lower so that kids are not only emotionally feeling more comfortable, but even physically feeling like, okay, I want to eat, I want to do this. I think that's so important. And this bridging, to me, it stretches kids. Like it stretches the edges of their comfort zone. So it's maybe not entirely comfortable, which is what's needed, because if we just leave them totally comfortable, they can't grow with anything. But we're pushing the edge of that, but in a way that still is manageable to them. And I feel like that is the key that so many people miss in trying to expand kids' food horizons. It's like this big leap, and it's like, no, we need to stretch the edge of that comfort zone, but it still needs to feel like something they can handle.
Completely. So yes, you said so much there. So what we really want to do is sort of two things. I guess the first is we really want to meet our child where they're at. So maybe you do have the child who can go from a cookie to a carrot, and that is awesome, and you should do that. If you don't, then you want to think, what is going to be sort of easiest for my child? What do they need? You'll want to think about their preferences and really maintain that. So I keep going back to the crunchy, going back to the crunchy, but we want to, pausing here, I think maybe, okay, we're back.
Okay, good.
Great. So we want to maintain their preferences as much as we can. So one way that you can do this is just looking at your child's, like all of their preferred foods, and just look for some patterns. And if you notice anything standing out, maybe it's color and texture, those are the things we want to keep as, you know, for as long as we can. Now, the size of the change, like what kind of change we're making. So can you go from a cookie all the way to a muffin, or do we need to have steps in between? That really depends on your child and their severity of eating anxiety or eating aversions and challenges, or maybe it depends on that particular food. So our goal is to really push the envelope just enough that the change is different and that it's productive, but not enough that like those alarm bells go off and the anxiety is going. So this can be a learning process, you know, and there's no like one direct path, because we really need to be paying attention to our child and, you know, and how they're doing with that particular food or even on that particular day.
Yeah, it's so true. You know, I've worked with kids where the changes initially have to be like infinitesimally small, like maybe even the, you know, muffin that they typically will eat, maybe just presented on a different type of plate, or maybe eating it in a different location or something like that, where you're not even making a change to the food at all initially. And then other kids can handle bigger changes. And so I think that point you're making is so important, that parents have to just try some things and sort of be attuned to their kids and figure out how many little steps are we going to need in here? And it's going to be different depending on the kiddo.
Yeah, exactly. So just always pay attention and look for those signs of them shutting down and, you know, what they need. And I love that you pointed out that sometimes it's not about the food. Sometimes that's not where we start. We need to start kind of earlier than that, like one step ahead. So you can definitely think about changing the presentation, in addition to changing where they're eating it or maybe what meal they're eating it for. You're changing what food you're pairing it with, or you're changing how you cut it. So you're going to cut that muffin in half today instead of having it whole. For some kids, that will be a really, really dramatic change.
Yeah. So let's talk about, because I know one of the things that, you know, so many parents and even professionals, it's like they have a hard time even thinking about what the changes might be. So you just laid out some options like location, when it's being served, what kind of, you know, plate or utensil, how we might cut it. So those are examples. What are some other examples of common ways that we can make some changes or bridge to things? You were thinking about what things like color.
Yeah. So I always I start by thinking about like the senses. So what do we see? It's what color, we see the size and the shape, what texture, what temperature, the brand can be something also that we think about changing. And then the presentation of kind of where, when, and how, and everything else that can go into it. So, you know, it might be something, you know, by using like a food coloring, and I always get flack for this, can be a natural food coloring, yes, right. It can be beet juice, yeah. You know, in like changing the color of the pancake. So the pancake, the flavor is not changed. Nothing is changed except for the color. And that can just be the first step of the bridge. And that gets us used to seeing change and can potentially lead us, you know, it's going to lead us somewhere. Mm-hmm. So you can think about that. You can think about, you know, if we're staying on this pancake example, cooking it a little bit longer, or cooking it a little bit less long. So, you know, the texture changes a little bit, or then the color changes a little bit just from the browning that you see. You can change the size of the pancake. It's bigger or smaller. Some kids need to have it oh so perfectly round. Maybe this one's not going to be perfectly around, or we're going to try a fun shape or a not fun shape. You're just going to, again, cut it right in half. You can add in, potentially this will change the taste as well. So it's another one that we can change is the taste, adding in a little bit of different kind of flour, or, like a flaxseed, or, you can be kind of, it's like fancy and healthy as you want, but just so easy to add things into baked goods. So you can add something in there and it'll change the look and the texture and the taste a little bit. So those, that's some good examples. What you're having it on the side, maybe we're having like a pancake sandwich, instead of regular pancakes, instead of kind of just that single, you can cut it in half. You can eat it with a fork. You can bite into it like a sandwich you would, or, a piece of bread. So you can really get creative, and none of these is a right or a wrong way. It's just a bunch of different ideas. So it is a little bit of a muscle that you need to exercise here on ways that you can change your food. And when you are making these changes, it can be helpful to also include your child in that change. You might want to ask their opinion, or the pancake example I love because it's so easy to get them involved. So changing the color might be a really big deal, but if they can help you make that change, if they can add the food coloring, if they can add in the whole wheat flour or make the shape in the pan, cut the pancake in half, that can be really helpful when they sort of they get that sense of involvement, which can increase their interest in eating, but they also sort of see that nothing has fundamentally changed. Their pancake, even though it's in half, it's still their pancake. So it's great to either demonstrate that to them or get them involved in the process.
And that really, makes me think about the fact that at the root of this for so many kids is this ability to engage in this flexible thinking, this same but different thinking. And I think especially that's one of the reasons why we see picky eating or feeding issues in kids on the autism spectrum, because that type of flexible thinking, that same but different, this is different, but fundamentally it's still the same. We know that from a cognitive standpoint, that tends to be a bit of a weaker area for kids on the spectrum. And so I think that idea that you just expressed of them being able to start seeing these bridges and making these connections in their brain of, oh yeah, it's different, but it's still the same. That's still the same pancake, even though it's a different color, a different shape. That is such a fundamental thing for kids to have in order to be able to move forward with eating. Really, but just with so many things in life, right? To be able to fundamentally have that same but different kind of thinking.
Exactly. Yeah, it's huge. And like you said, this really comes down to sort of control and dependability and knowing what we can expect at the table. So these can be, to us, you may be hearing this and thinking like, sure, I'll cut the pancake in half, no big deal. To some of our kids, that's a huge, huge deal. So you really do want to start small and sort of be sensitive to this and help them along, and know that like it seems silly to you, but it could seem silly to you, but this is, a very small step in the whole bridge, the long journey. And I think you mentioned before, Nicole, that, sometimes like our first change has to be so small, but over time, once our kids get more used to these changes and they start to exercise that flexibility muscle, the bigger changes and more newness, more change becomes a lot easier for them. So it's always the beginning, that is the hardest. And I see once we start to get more flexible with food in the beginning, then that's something that we can sort of generalize. So the first couple of foods might be really difficult to come by, and then we, it sort of gets the ball rolling.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because it can feel really demoralizing to parents at first. Like, oh my gosh, if I have to, have 20 steps between food A and food B for, my kid's going to be 90 before they, get to 30 foods in their diet. But it gathers steam and it gets quicker once they get comfortable with it. I'm thinking about kids, because this is a lot of kids who fall in the picky eating category, kids who want everything separate, or like I'm thinking about parents who say like, okay, they'll eat noodles, they, will do sauce on pizza, they'll eat plain noodles, but like will not do like pasta with sauce on it. What's up with that? So give some examples of how a parent could think about bridging that. It's like, okay, they'll eat the pizza with the tomato sauce on it. They'll eat plain noodles in the bowl, but never shall the two, things meet. What would be some options or some ideas there?
That is trick. These are like this sort of mixed food, and these things that we see is like so kind of like these giant contradictions they're very hard. So the plain pasta, or sort of like the sauces and dips, is something that we can use. And this is so helpful if you can start to use sauces and dips as a tool, because that can be a great bridge in and of itself. But as we're working up to it, one thing that I like to do is we can sort of start by just playing and experimenting. So maybe we're dipping the pasta into the sauce, or like, have your child do that. They can dip this tiny little piece. They don't even maybe have to eat it at first. Maybe they're just experimenting and they're playing with it a little bit. They're just getting a feel. But eventually maybe they could dip the pasta in the sauce just a little bit if they want, and then they could lick it off, and use the pasta almost as like the spoon or the fork. And sort of you can go from there and increase. Maybe then they can eat a little bite together. Maybe they can wipe it off and then they're eating a bite of the pasta. Eventually I started to see something like maybe, I'm starting at the very smallest possible step here. Like maybe one noodle has sauce. So they have a whole bowl of their favorite pasta and just one noodle has sauce, and they can eat that one or eat around that one. And eventually we want to increase the amount of sauce that's in there. And this is a great opportunity, again, to have your child involved with the addition of the sauce. So you can, they're the one who's practicing the dipping, then maybe they're adding the sauce. You can always get silly with this depending on your child's age, like, oh, the noodle's going swimming. And it's all saucy here. It's jumping into the pool of sauce. Get creative, get silly, whatever sort of lights them up. And even for older kids, you can create this cognitive bridge for them as well. Like, this is a sauce on our pizza, and you can kind of try the sauce on its own, and just make that connection on putting the sauce on the pasta. And when you're doing this too, I think it seems so simple for us to think, well, they like sauce on the pizza, so like it's the same sauce. Why don't they like it? We have to sort of think like the texture is different, it's like it's a whole other thing that's going on here. So is it the cheese on top that's making it better for them? Is it that the pizza's baked so the sauce is like a little drier? It's sort of not as slippery. And on the pasta, it gets sort of wet. So like, let's play around maybe with the texture, or sometimes when it sits out a little bit more, it gets like sort of drier. So I know it seems silly, but just all things to play with. I was working with a little boy who we tried macaroni and cheese like a dozen times, and he just really never liked it. And then one day we had it, and it was sitting on his plate as we were like going through trying some other foods, and it had sat there. And I initially said, let's do the mac and cheese first while it's warm. Let's try that. He, just didn't want to do it. He was saving it for the end. And all of a sudden, this was the day that he liked it. And I think part of why he liked it was because it was a little bit colder. It was like a little drier. So there's all these things, and we just want to get that information and like experiment, even if it seems a little, unconventional.
Yeah, I think, again, it's getting in their mind instead of looking at it from our mind.
Mm-hmm.
And that brings up, I think, an important piece here, which is the role of giving kids some choices within some things. And, I don't know with this boy that you're working, but it sounded like maybe you gave him some choices of which to start with, or, you've kind of alluded in lots of examples of giving kids some control through choices, like here's the options, which I'm in charge of providing, but you get some choice about how to explore that or what to do first. Do you feel like that's an important thing?
Huge.
Yeah.
Huge. So whenever we can get them involved, we're going back to that control, going back to that sense of, just involvement. I'm thinking of the wrong word, but when when you're involved in something, you take this ownership over it, and you start to feel good and like committed to it. So I love any way that we can get kids involved. And it's not only like the control with food, then it's also that often they're getting like that sensory exposure, and just all of it. Exposure is so important with food. So even if they're not eating it, but they're playing with it or touching it, that is so valuable. So you know, you get them involved in any way, like if you're cooking, get them involved in cooking with you, but give them choices, give them heads up. You're making a menu, you know that you're having these 5 dishes, you know, you planned out the week, you know, you want these 5 meals, ask them which night, you know, like on Monday, would you prefer pizza or pasta? You know, you're picking the choices, you know that this week you're having both of those. Let them decide which one is going on the menu ahead of time. Or you can ask them, you know, would you prefer for dinner tomorrow the pasta or the roll? So you, like you said, you want to control that choice, but giving them the ability to choose, they feel that involvement, they know what to expect, and it's their choice. So much of their day is their life is not things that they can control. And any way that we can give them, you know, just more expectation and more ownership over what's happening is really, really helpful.
To that point, I'm wondering your thoughts on, you know, we've talked about how pressure and, you know, anxiety and stress are not helpful where all of this stuff is concerned for kids. And, you know, there is this school of thought out there of, well, just put it in front of them and tell them they have to eat it. I mean, I hear stories all the time. I even remember from my childhood, like some standoffs at the table of like, you need to have 5 bites of that before you can leave. And so I'm wondering your thoughts around that, and especially where it pertains to this idea of, you know, should parents force the issue and say, this is what's made for dinner. If you don't, you know, want it, then fine, don't eat it, but there's nothing else, versus always making sure that there's something they will eat. Because I think this comes up for families all the time. And there's very conflicting advice out there, right, about how to handle that.
Yeah. So I think this, you know, we have to think back a little bit to like, maybe what sort of picky eater do you have on your hands? So I generally recommend that there needs to always be a preferred food at the table for your child. And so I think even, you know, I can argue no problem that this should be the case regardless of kind of how we're categorizing your picky eater. It's not fair to ask them to, you know, to come to the table and like, imagine, you know, like we're having pig's brains tonight. Like, this is what I made. You know, it's up to you. Fine. You know, you don't want it. Okay. That's not really fair. And you can put yourself in that situation as well. If there's something that is really so uncomfortable to you don't want to eat it. That's not fair. You're hungry. You're expecting a meal. So I am in the party that we should always have a preferred food, but I also, you know, I do not recommend sort of having that safety meal. So generally that's my recommendation. There are totally times in situations where like some families have, you know, like if you're not eating anything, you're not happy, like this is the one option and you can go get it type thing. And that can definitely work. But I do not recommend, you know, saying like, oh, you know, you don't like what's on the table. No problem. I will go make you your very favorite. Because that is a situation when we, you know, then there's no room for growth at that point. But
and parents totally stress. I mean, the number of parents who are short order cooking then and tearing their hair out over that. Yeah, I agree.
It's not, it really doesn't do anybody any favors. It doesn't get you anywhere. It makes you as a parent very frustrated, more dishes, more time, messes up your whole family, like meal dynamic. So that, but the way that we avoid the need to do that is by saying, this is a preferred food. You know, it is up to you. You eat chicken nuggets 99% of the time. If today is that 1% day, then, you know, like, I'm sorry, you know, and that's where you can figure out how you want to, you know, if you need sort of an emergency snack that you just so happen to, you know, conveniently offer on this particular night, that can be something that you do. But you do kind of want to have the meal at the table, and generally that would be the meal. And of course that meal, it contains the preferred food, and it should contain non-preferred foods as well, just for exposure. There's no requirement to eat them, but it's there. The option is there. And that really, you know, leaves the door open and also breaks down barriers between like, this is your food. These are the only foods that I know you will eat. This is everybody else's food. Don't even think about it. That's not for you.
Yeah.
So we want to create that like fluidity of the option is there when you are ready.
Yeah. And I love that idea of, you know, how I approach it is, oh, yet oh, these aren't things you're eating yet, or this isn't something that you've gotten comfortable yet, but here it is, we're all eating it, you know, we're not going to exclude you from it. And it's a yet kind of situation, because to me, the language that we use around this is really critical. So many kids even hear us as parents, professionals talking about, and they get labeled by that, right? Oh, I'm a picky eater, I don't eat those things.
Yep.
Or I can't eat those things, or I won't eat those things. And they hear all of that and they internalize that. And then that's sort of their story around it, right? Which is not what we want to have happen.
Correct. We are still learning. We are in the process. Maybe this food or, you know, particular foods, or maybe eating in general is a little bit harder for you right now, but we're working on it. We just don't like that yet. It takes a lot of time. We do really want to have that growth mentality, and, you know, where all foods are an option, and we're still learning. It's just, you know, math is really hard for some people and eating is really hard for others.
I love that. One more question before we wrap up, and it's sort of in the same vein of how we communicate about things, but I'm just thinking a big issue that comes up from parents is how to respond to when a kid says, you know, I'm not eating that, or that's yucky, I don't like that, you know, and parents go, I'm not sure what to say. Do I say, oh, well, you used to, or, oh, yes, you do? Or, I mean, what do you encourage parents to say when kids are responding like that to a food?
Yeah, it is tricky. And I think we are all sort of conditioned. I don't know, it's how we were raised, or it's just human nature to want to say like, yes, you do, you ate it yesterday, you used to like it. But I think it's just, we just want them to eat and we're so desperate, but that is generally not helpful. Some kids will feel that as pressure, or they will just sort of want to defy what you're saying. And like, you can't tell me what I do and I don't like, I'm going to show you, you know, even if it's not sort of with a negative intent like that. So you can just ignore it sometimes, you know, like, I think that is one, you know, we want to avoid sort of that negative reinforcement. So there, you know, like, you're sitting down at the table, the broccoli's there, ugh, gross. Don't even pay attention to that. Like, just let that go. You know, you can always throw in a, like, we're still learning, and you don't like that yet. I hear you saying you're not interested in having the broccoli tonight. No problem. You don't have to have that. You know, you can definitely throw in, like, the rest of us are going to enjoy it. So, you know, it's going to be here. You don't have to eat it. I'm always okay if they're very uncomfortable with something on their plate. No problem. You can just move it to the side. You know, I like that you can. And again, if they're moving it with their hand, like, that's a great exposure for them. That's a great interaction. So I think we just don't really want to, you know, I say people don't like to talk about foods as good or bad. And I don't like to have any of that in a different way, that bad language at the table. So it's not that, you know, the cookies are bad for you, but none of this food is bad. It's just, we don't like it yet. It's, you know, ignore sort of that negative talk, and just instead try to foster that growth mentality.
I love it. So good. You've provided so many really practical things that everybody who's listening can take and start applying with their kids. Honestly, whether or not you have a picky eater, I mean, some of this is just great stuff. Like the things we wish we knew as parents before we, you know, had our first one, right? I think it's super helpful. I want to make sure that people know where they can find out more about you and your work, where they can find you online.
Yeah, thank you. So I am most often on Instagram at Feeding Picky Eaters. And you can also find me on my website, where you'll get hooked up with my blog and my book, at jennyfriedmannutrition.com.
And we will link to all those resources in the show notes so that people can easily get there. And I will just say, I think that the visuals and the information you put on Instagram are so helpful as just a great introduction to helping parents think about what's really going on with kids with picky eating, and giving some strategies. So definitely want to give a plug for people to go and follow you and check out your work there. And thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today and to talk about these things. Super, super helpful. And we thank you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
And thanks to all of you, as always, for listening. We'll catch you back here next time for our next episode of the Better Behavior Show.